Before this episode begins, we urge you to take a look at the Jazz Omnibus, the 600-page anthology of 21st century photos and writings by members of the Jazz Journalists Association, available online and wherever books are sold. And now, on with the show.
Hello and welcome to a 2024 JJA Book Awards author interview on the Buzz podcast. I'm Bob Blumenthal, here with Steve Isoardi, author of The Dark Tree, Jazz and the Community Arts in Los Angeles. Among 6 nominees in the category History, Criticism, and Culture to be voted on by members of the Jazz Journalists Association. Welcome, Steve, and thank you for joining us today.
Many thanks, you guys, for the honor.
It appears to me that this has been a lifetime project of yours. So let me start with how you got started and how you persevered.
You're right. And actually, it's kind of a story of sometimes in life, doors open in front of you, and you have to decide whether to walk through or not. I think in a lot of cases, most people don't. Happens more often than not. But in this case, I did. And that led me on a life's journey that began in 1989, which was documenting African-American jazz, especially, and culture in Los Angeles. Before then, I'd started studying saxophone with a great teacher here named Bill Green in 1987. But before then, my life was involved in academia. My PhD is in political science, international relations specialty. It's about as far removed from the streets of South Central Los Angeles as you can get. And I was pretty heavily involved in politics. And when I started studying with Bill, I'd always wanted to pursue music. He was the person who really hit me to the history of the music in the Black community, especially Central Avenue. He had been part of that scene in the 40s. And at the time, he encouraged me to do something about it if I was interested, because he and members and his friends were getting older. Nothing much had been done to document it. I certainly knew nothing about it. I thought I knew something about the history of jazz. So I became intrigued, and he encouraged me, told me he'd introduce me to people, and I basically began an oral history project then in '89 to document that history in the first half of the 20th century in Los Angeles. And since then, it pretty much has dominated my life. My teaching went from lecturing in international relations to offering more and more courses in African-American music and culture. And basically, it's what I've been doing, aside from teaching some political science and social studies, since 1989. And The Dark Tree kind of came out of that because one of the people I interviewed for Central Avenue was Horace Tapscott. And what little I knew about him and his organization and his work in South Central utterly fascinated me. Both I love the music and I like their history of political commitment. And when the opportunity to interview Horace came up for Central Avenue, I was thrilled. We had a great time doing it. And that really created a desire on my part to document that movement. So when Central Avenue project was finished, I wanted to move on and do that. And he gave me the okay shortly before his passing. And that's how The Dark Tree came about then.
Okay, now, as someone who is not part of the community and not an insider, any insights in how you win the trust of your subjects? Because you've documented interviews with literally dozens of people who are all part of this community organization, and you were not part of the community. So was that a challenge?
It certainly was. But it was in many ways, and I was very much aware of that. But I had been kind of involved in the community doing political work as early as 1979. So it wasn't completely foreign to me, but I was unaware of much of the cultural history. And after I had studied with Bill, and when I started Central Avenue, that wasn't so much an issue because that generation from the 30s and the 40s were much more integration minded. And initially were much more open and welcoming. I think they also saw me as a student of Bill's, and I was really welcomed. I thought after a short period of time I had another family of aunts and uncles. It was that welcoming. But I also knew when I started working with Horace and subsequently documenting that the generations who came up in the 60s and 70s, who were much more militantly nationalist in their orientation, that the reaction would be certainly, who is this guy, if they didn't know me. And I knew that was going to be there. But it was also one of those things that, in a sense, other than doing what I thought was right and honoring the history, there was nothing I could kind of do about that other than be a good presence and do my work well. And I learned that if you do that, and that if you show where your heart and your spirit is, and it's in the right place, that you're not coming into the community trying to take something from someone or trying to build a career on their life's work, trying to take something and run away and then build a career on their life's work, that you would gradually gain the support of people. And I think that's kind of what happened. When I met Horace, and well, I'd met him before, but when I started working with him in 93 on Central, it wasn't until 97 that he asked me to write his autobiography with him. And my friend, the poet Kamal Daoud, later told me, during those years, Horace was watching you. And so his attitude was always to get a sense, especially of someone outside the community, what they were about, what was their spirit, what were they coming to contribute or not. And once he came to a positive conclusion, given his expansive understanding of community, he would welcome you in. And that's kind of the way it evolved. When I first got involved documenting the history of the orchestra, there were a lot of the younger guys who would say, who is this cat? What's he done, etc.
Yeah.
And all I could do was keep doing my work with Horace's backing. That's all I needed, and nothing else mattered. If he wanted me, and that also opened the doors. So I just kept at it.
Okay, now, as you say, you basically edited his autobiography, I take it. And
right.
And I think it's worth pointing out to people, The Dark Tree is not a biography of Horace Tapscott. It's really a biography of a community with Horace Tapscott as a focal point. And I wondered if there were challenges of balancing the community aspect of the story, the musical aspect of the story, the individual personalities. Did this confront you as a problem, or was it smooth sailing?
What do you mean by balancing with individual personality?
Well, I mean, for instance, there's a great appendix by Roberto Miranda, which really talks about the musical uniqueness of Horace Tapscott and the contributions musically. And if you read the book, you're not getting musical analysis of his harmonic conception or whatever. So a choice was made that instead of making that the focus, you could pull it out at the end of the book. Those kind of questions.
Yeah, to talk about that issue in particular, there were a couple of considerations. One was the fact that my background was not as a musicologist. It was as a social scientist. Yes, I'd studied, with Bill Green for a number of years, but that was mostly technique and execution, things like that. It wasn't detailed study of harmony or music theory. I did some on my own, but that was it. So I was kind of reluctant to move that way anyway. That was one aspect of it. The other part was that when I tried to talk with Horace about his music, he was very reluctant to get into it. I would ask about compositions, and he would defer. I'd press him. I might get a few sentences out of a piece, what might have prompted it, what a title might have meant, things like this. But that was it. And then I would say, are there any other pieces you'd like to talk about? He'd say no. It's not an unusual thing I've found with a lot of artists who just don't want to get into an intellectual discussion about this, about what is behind their music in a musicological sense or an artistic sense. It's almost like they don't want to touch that. They don't want to interfere with the creative process. It reminded me actually of a quote that I've had in my head for a while of the composer Gustav Mahler, who said music is not in the notes, it's in the spirit. And or Dmitri Shostakovich, who utterly refused to talk about his compositions, thought it was pointless. And he said, so what if I did this in the fourth movement of my Eighth Symphony? Who cares? And he refused to discuss it. And
well,
in a lot of ways,
you've touched upon two composers who basically said, in Mahler's case, I'll convert my religion, art's my religion. And Shostakovich, you said, I'll make political concessions because art is my politics. But I want to keep moving because we do have limited time here. You early in the book, you talk about other organizations and other communities, and it raised some questions in my mind about what is similar and what's different about what happened in Los Angeles. For instance, the Black Artist Group in St. Louis, which included theater and visual arts and dance, as well as music, or the AACM in Chicago, which was basically spearheaded by one charismatic figure, Muhal Richard Abrams. But there are also differences. So I wonder if you could sort of summarize what sets the Los Angeles model apart.
There are a number of things that set it apart. We can point to particular things, such as the fact of what they didn't have. Unlike the AACM, they did not have a strong organizational structure. They didn't have a developed program in a written sense. It took them quite a few years to come up with any kind of a legal foundation structure, officers, et cetera, and then that was short-lived. I guess the best way to characterize what was going on in LA came from Horace's vision of community. It more than anything else, they attempted to merge as artists with the community. And it was a very loose structure in which they would live in the community, they would work in the community, they would perform informally and formally throughout the community. So I guess the best way to describe it in a sense is less structure, but more of a West African traditional community ethos, where art becomes one with the life of the community and nothing apart from it, trying to merge yourself that way. So, which on the one hand is positive in a lot of ways, in other ways it creates problems of structure and longevity, which is what the organization has been wrestling with since Horace passed, because he was kind of the spirit that motivated that.
Now, there's a great deal in the book about politics as well as music. And there's sections that fascinated me about the organization's relationship to the Panthers in the early 70s and late 60s, to the gangs that rose up in the 80s, and a balance that was attempted to be maintained. And I wonder if you could just speak to that a little, how you see it.
One of the things that attracted me so much to Horace and to other musicians like Buddy Collette to an extent was their political consciousness and how they saw their art in relation to their communities and to society and to political problems. And they achieved kind of a merging of that more than any other artist that I'm familiar with in Los Angeles. And from the beginning, that was always an element in the organization, to be an active force within the community, supporting whatever they thought was positive in helping the life of the community. And so they would support organizations at times politically somewhat conflictual, but if they felt they were doing something positive, they were there. So they never strongly identified with one political social organization. They never drew up political programs or anything like this, but they would have collective discussions about whether or not an organization was helping the community, and if so, they would support it. So one musician told me that in the 60s, one day, they played one afternoon for the Black Panthers at a rally, and later that night, they played for a rally of some African-American Democratic candidates, because they felt, in both cases, that they were positive forces within their community. To them, this was kind of a basic element of the organization. The organization simply couldn't exist without this ethos. And it animated everything they did.
One real invaluable aspect of the book for people like myself who only are aware of what music goes on in Los Angeles through what gets recorded, basically, is to learn about some people I had heard of and some I had not. So I want to just ask you for some capsule comments. Let me start with the people I haven't heard of who seem to be very important. One is Linda Hill.
Yes. Actually, we're hoping people will know more. There's a book in progress now celebrating 60 years of the orchestra, and there may be an essay on Linda, which I hope happens. Linda Hill was someone who most people wouldn't know much about. I mean, the only kind of recorded evidence are some of the albums that Tom Albach of Nimbus West put out involving Linda. But if Horace was the patriarch of the organization, Linda was the matriarch. And she, in some ways, more than Horace, was a practical unifying force for the organization, because she was in the middle of the organization, the structure. She was in the middle of the communal residences that they had over a 20-year period. She never distinguished herself, as an outstanding soloist or path-breaking musician. But musically, she had so much talent. So much of it was self-taught, so much of it under Horace's tutelage. She had some training as a young person, but she just committed herself wholeheartedly to the organization and to learning music. She turned herself into a decent arranger. And she could play, I don't know how many different instruments. Again, not at a world-class level or anything like that, but very much was a guiding spirit.
Well, I was going to say, it struck me that more than any musical contributions, her centering of the organization and being probably second only to Horace is someone whose opinions mattered to everyone involved. So I found that very enlightening. Also, Greg Kufahamu, the DJ. Could you speak a little about Greg?
Actually, it wasn't long after that he changed his first name to Aman. So for quite a few years now, he's been Aman Kufahamu. And Kuf he's still with us, fortunately. He was a guy who loved music, though he didn't play, and he got into music technology. And as a young man, as I wrote in the book, he persuaded Dr. Borges at USC to give him a radio program when they were seeking outreach opportunities within the Black community. USC, of course, was right in the Black community. And they knew they had better start reaching out after their incredibly conservative and reactionary past. And they gave Kufahamu this radio show, which over 3 years was really an important force within the community. So many musicians I talked to and young people in general became aware of so much great jazz being produced in the mid and later 60s. A lot of them discovered John Coltrane for the first time listening to Kufahamu's radio program. And Kufahamu was a really important force in giving radio time and performance opportunities to musicians in the community. He supported that in a major, major way. He also created an organization with some other artists, and they would promote concerts, put up visual artwork at concerts, and then bring in some of the local musicians to play. People like Azar Lawrence, Horace and the Ark, the Bobby Bradford, John Carter New Art Jazz Ensemble, etc. And eventually, a number of them merged with Horace Tapscott and UGMA because they were on the same path.
Okay. In the limited time we have left, I want to mention one person I knew a little about and was glad to learn more about, and one I knew a little more about. Samuel Brown. Could you just briefly talk about Samuel Brown?
Well, Samuel Brown is such an important figure in African American culture in the middle of the 20th century. He was one of the first African Americans hired in Los Angeles public schools when he was hired at Jefferson High School in 1936. Before that time, African Americans had only been hired at the elementary level, not at the high school. And he was hired to teach music. And Samuel Brown was an interesting man. His life was music. He went to USC, received his degrees in music, eminently qualified. But his training was in European classical. It wasn't in jazz, but when he got to Jeff and he started working with the kids, he embraced jazz because he said that's what they all wanted. And he created a really important, for 20 years, jazz program. He created a jazz big band, which 6-period every day at Jefferson, met in a bungalow, and he had the big band playing throughout LA. He had those students writing music, arranging music, and they would be able to hear it right away in their classes. And he mentored just many, many people. And because of the racism too, he said the students were his best friends because the rest of the faculty wouldn't have anything to do with him. So he hung out with the students all the time, and he would bring them down to Central Avenue into the clubs, and he would bring leading jazz artists when they were in town to Jefferson to meet the kids, to talk to them, to perform. One of his good friends was William Grant Still, the composer. And William Grant Still would come and work with the kids and talk to them. He mentored Horace Tapscott into the 1960s. So Samuel Brown was just a major force. I mean, just for a period of 20 years, most of the prominent jazz musicians who came through LA came through the school of Samuel Brown.
Well, not to belittle by saying he seems like the Walter Diet of Los Angeles, where people are familiar with the history of Chicago and mentors. The other person who I knew a little bit more about is Marla Gibbs. Now, many people will be too young to know that name, but Marla Gibbs was a regular character in a comedy, situation comedy in the 1970s. She played a maid on The Jeffersons, I believe.
Yes.
And yet she turned out to be one of the biggest supporters of what Horace and the community were doing, right?
She really embraced the same ethos. And as everybody used to say, she put her money where her ideas were. And she, for decades, was a huge supporter. And she's still going strong. She's like 95 now. And Marla, when she was introduced to Horace and she met him before the TV show, she was just taken by the ethos, the activity, what they were doing. She was working out at LAX with an airline at a terminal, and she was spending all of her free time down in Watts studying acting at some of the workshops. Her daughter, Angela, introduced to Horace. She also sang some, and she just became so supportive of that whole movement. To her, that it really resonated with her artistic impulses and what she wanted to do in the community. And she also felt that if you're going to be involved with the community, you have to commit to it. And for her, that meant writing checks. And what she brought to Horace and the other artists was a sense of organization and structure, which they'd never had before. It was thanks to Marla that UGMA became a legal foundation and a structure. And she not only provided some financial support, she was not only instrumental in making UGMA a legal foundation, but then she went and bought a building, which housed then the orchestra and UGMA and her acting classes and workshops, and even provided residence space for some of the musicians. Amazing lady.
I was fascinated with his approach to both who was in the orchestra, which reminded me of Sun Ra, who would take people who weren't particularly great musicians, but he felt that it would personally help them overcome whatever problems they had. and also with the way he ran the band. I mean, like Muhal, for instance, he would not tell soloists how to play solos.
Yeah.
But unlike Muhal, he was not meticulous about the ensembles. And then there are other people who I've been told were meticulous about how you're supposed to play your solo, and you could play the ensemble any way you wanted. So I just found his whole approach to leading an orchestra fascinating.
In looking at who he was and what he did, I think the best summary was when, I don't know if you know the Nigerian poet and novelist Chris Abani.
I don't.
If that name rings a bell. He's now at Northwestern University, but he's very accomplished. Chris read for me a manuscript of The Dark Tree, and I wanted, afterwards he came up to me, and the first thing he said was, Horace is completely African. He thought that what he was about, who he was, everything he did resonated with West African traditional culture. And I think it was imprinted on his DNA somehow. This is how he lived and acted. And the more I read and studied about West African culture, the way music was in the community, the way music was passed along traditionally, the way young people were brought in and brought up in the music through absorption, I think this was Horace completely.
Howard,
so I think Chris was right.
Did you ever get a chance to hear him play live?
Horace Tapscott, I think I heard him in New York at Kobe Narita's place. I think he was playing solo, if I don't.
Well, I only heard him once at a club in Somerville, Massachusetts called the Willow. He was probably on his way back from New York, and he played a solo set. And I mean, I knew the recordings, but it was a rare opportunity. But it was, so many people can come through one time only, and it blends. It's like my memory of that is like my memory of hearing Freddie Red, So it's not like I can distinguish them as
Howard, did you see at the Iridium by any chance? 98 at the Iridium in New York?
No.
Would have been August 98.
And that would have been with Cecil McBee and Andrew Cyril?
No. It was the Arabesque trio.
Oh, okay.
That he had. And I talked to Stanley Crouch about it because he was there. And Randy Weston also caught him there. And it was one of those things where he played that week at Iridium with his trio using only his left hand.
That was fascinating, that part of the book, when you talk about him after his medical problems. You've been listening to The Buzz, the podcast of the Jazz Journalists Association. This edition has been edited by Wiz Petta, with John Michael's composition Big Vic as our theme music. Check back for more of The Buzz.